Hey folks, thank you for joining me, and today's quite a big one actually. For ages and ages I have enjoyed Cthulhu games and the general Arkham Horror mythos. And probably my first entry into the whole genre was Arkham Horror, the second edition of the game. Now these are just the rulebooks because everything's contained in a giant wooden vault and I no longer own the original boxes, but suffice to say, it was a pretty beastly game. I mean, you had a lot of rules to learn, it was fairly fiddly, but I don't think any Cthulhu game has come close to replicating the horror theme from all the games that are in there. I mean, Eldritch Horror is more of an adventure-style game. The Arkham Horror LCG is probably the second best in that field, I'll give it that. But just pure horror, just pure, oh my god, that's creepy imagery, or that's like horrific looking pictures and stuff like that, or just, you know, oh my god, what are these encounters we're having? Nothing could beat the second edition of Arkham Horror for me. It was just so much fun. The problem is, it hasn't been played for a long time because it is such a smorgasbord of expansions and components and rules that are probably hard to remember by now. So it was inevitable that if Eldritch Horror was going to reach a stopping point, although when's that ever going to happen? Hello, expansions. But you know, they were going to make it. They were going to make another one. They were going to revamp it. This was inevitable. And here it is. Arkham Horror 3rd edition. This was quite a big deal when they announced it, and you know, I was ho-hum about it. I'm not saying that's my verdict, I'm saying I was ho-hum about the whole announcement, because part of me really wants to play the 2nd edition again, and then the 3rd edition was announced. It's like, does that mean this is going to completely replace 2nd edition? Will 2nd edition now just sit on my shelf in a giant wooden box and never ever get played again? Possibly, but that's got nothing to do with the game. It's just such a big beastly thing to get out. It's kind of like, I wasn't sure what to make of it. So, how does it fare? Does it replace the 2nd edition? Can it exist in its own right? Did they improve it? Did they make it worse? Let's find out. Arkham Horror is a cooperative game of mystery and terror for up to 6 players, but it can also be played solo. Inspired by the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, each unique scenario in the game puts you in the shoes of one of Arkham's many investigators, all taken from directly the Arkham Horror lore, as they explore the streets of the city and work together to save humanity from unknowable horrors such as Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Azathoth, and many other names that I am probably not pronouncing very well. Much like in the 2nd edition of the game, your adventure takes place in Arkham City, and here you will travel to many locations directly from the lore in order to find clues about specific aspects of the threat in question, such as possibly finding out where Cthulhu will spawn, or the time that Azathoth is likely to enter our world, and such things. But it's not as simple as that, because many monsters and cultist enemies will want to stop your progress. On top of that, not every encounter you find is going to be friendly or uneventful, and you will have to battle against many different adversaries and many different events in order to succeed at your goal, depending on the scenario you are playing. Each scenario will change the way the map is laid out, the way the encounter cards are dealt, and even the main goal of the game itself. This game can take anywhere from 2 to 3 hours plus, so it is not a short game by any means, but allows for a group of between 1 and 6 players to really engage in a thematic, story-driven mythos that has been ongoing for many years in board gaming history. Each of your investigators has a special ability and a set of stats and items that differentiate you from other people. Some will be better fared at combating evil monsters, and others may be best at researching clues and trying to progress the goal of the scenario. Unfortunately, time is of the essence here, and if you don't hurry, it's possible the scenario may just want to end it for you by letting the world collapse into chaos. Will you be able to stop the engaging threat in time, or will you yourself be driven insane at the madness of Arkham Horror? So everything in the box looks as good as it always will from Fantasy Flight. You're going to recognise certain artwork pieces from the LCG, from Eldritch Horror, possibly even the previous Arkham Horror and Mansion of Madness games, but all in all, there is some unique artwork in here, and it all looks gorgeous. It makes you want this to become like a movie production or something, and to be fair, this is the sort of mythos I would love to see as a proper horror movie production. You know, it doesn't have to be gory, doesn't have to be all Hollywood-esque cliche. You could do a really good horror film with this kind of mythos, but I digress. So everything looks the part, you know it's going to, pop on the table, the tiles are nice and big and sturdy, the artwork looks beautiful, nice and colourful, and just generally, it all looks pretty good. Now in terms of the content, you know that Fantasy Flight is going to do exactly what they do with every single franchise they do, milk the cash cow for all it's worth. It's going to happen. The cards that come in this game are somewhat limited. There's only so many cards for the various encounters in the districts, and there's a reasonable amount for what they call a codex, which is kind of like progressing the act forward, the various progressions of the game. It's a bit like how the act and agenda cards work in the LCG, and there's a fair amount of those, but of course everything is kind of built in such a way that you just know they're waiting to expand this. And you know it's going to happen. They've done it with every single Arkham Horror before. Whatever they say, even if they came out and said on a press announcement, we're not expanding Arkham Horror 3rd edition, I would not believe them. Because let's face it, it's Fantasy Flight and this is Arkham Horror. So I can expect that even if there's not that many encounter cards with each particular district, you know that expansions are going to come out, they're going to add to those decks, and eventually this thing will get too big for its britches. It's going to happen. So ignoring the 2nd edition, how does it play in general? It is a good fun game. Anybody who's played a previous Arkham Horror game is going to recognize how this works, particularly the LCG. I think they've actually borrowed some mechanics and adapted them from the LCG, it feels. And you've still got that great sort of horror/adventure mythos of going to the locations, reading the encounter cards, getting a nice story element from it, role-playing your character. All this still comes through. In terms of the balance versus horror and adventure, I'd say this is a cross between Eldritch and Arkham Horror. Because Arkham Horror I always thought had more of the horror put down and less of the adventure. Whereas Eldritch Horror I thought was the opposite way round. It was more like Indiana Jones meets Cthulhu rather than a horrific game. This one sits in the middle, probably a little bit behind something like the LCG, because the LCG is doing a very good job at keeping up the horror element of the game as well as making it a fun adventure game. So this kind of sits a little bit below that, I suppose more accurately between the LCG and Eldritch Horror in terms of the horror mythos that there is. The mechanics of the game have been streamlined a great deal though. The Arkham Horror 2nd edition is well known for being quite clunky, very bloated with rules, especially with the expansions, and generally just a lot to learn and a lot to get wrong. With this one, it's definitely been more streamlined. The rulebook is not exactly small, and it may look a bit daunting as you first look at it, but I got taught this game first rather than went from the rulebook. And then when I looked at the rulebook, I thought, the game didn't feel that complex when I was learning it, and it doesn't. Once you've got the rules down about the basics, what actions you can do, how the encounter cards work, how the clue research encounters work, and just generally how that little codex works with progressing the goal of the game, most of it is actually fairly easy enough to keep going. The turns are going to be rinse repeat, so the rules will start sticking in your mind, and each scenario is going to be different, so there will be slight tweaks to the rules, but for the most part, most of it will remain the same. You have reference guides, sorry for the noise out there, I'm afraid. You'll have reference cards for things like the actions that you can do and how the turn sequence works, so there's plenty of ways to learn the game without it being too much of a clunky experience. I feel that they've definitely got that down in terms of making this more accessible to people who maybe haven't played a lot of games before. And it is a co-op, so it's not like that people can't help you out if you're struggling. Now, the time length is a little bit of an issue for me though. All the Eldritch Horror, Arkham Horror games are generally quite long. The only one that's not as long is the LCG. You can get that done in less than an hour. But that's per scenario though. But to get an Eldritch Horror game done, the Arkham Horror 2nd edition done, the Mansions of Madness 2nd edition done, you're talking hours and hours and hours to play those games. This can end up in the same situation. It says 2 to 3 hours on the box. That's a bare minimum. You're talking a good 2 to 3 hour game here. And I have seen games of this where people have got 4 to 6 players that go on for really long times. And it just, oh my god, it spirals out of control in how much time it takes. And I wish they'd managed to shorten that. I was hoping that with a 3rd edition they would make it so that it didn't take so long to play a game. It says 1 to 6 players. You will not catch me playing this with more than 4 ever. In fact, you probably will never catch me playing this with more than 3. It's good to have an extra person there. 2 or 3 players is great. 4 if people aren't too slow. But even then, I remember playing this for a long time for my first game, 4 players of this. 5 and 6 players, no way. It is not happening. I am never going to do it. Screw that for a game of toy soldiers or Cthulhu monsters, I suppose. Toy cultists. Yeah, I suppose that's how it works. So, not the speediest game in the world, but definitely a more streamlined edition. You know, that much has got to be said. The roleplay element is still there from a theme perspective. You know, I'm there playing Jenny Barnes with all my money, and I've got all the money in the world. I can sail across half the village, half the city, and get stuff done. I think my first game I played, who did I play? I forget his name. He's the mobster. And I basically decided I wanted to be a combat munchkin, so I just got my Tommy gun and just hunted down every single monster I could find, which was brilliant for the fact that one of my starting items was my car. So I basically drove around Arkham finding monsters to run over in my car while shooting them up with Tommy guns. I mean, that was pretty awesome. But, you know, the others got the whole idea of like, oh yeah, you advance the plot. Oh, cultist. It was basically somewhat of a deranged killing spree that my mobster went on. But this game allows for a good sense of thematic roleplay. Now, my favourite aspect of Arkham Horror has always been those encounter cards. I love the way that the story is told through those cards, where you read the paragraph of text, you imagine what's going on, and even though you've got to effectively chuck a die, and it's the same deal, you know, dice rolls are in this game, and they may hose you, they may help you, you never know, you still get that cool story element as it's being told throughout the scenario. And the advantage here, certainly over the previous Arkham Horror, is that because the scenarios are tailored to each foe that you're doing, the encounter cards that you find and the codex are more tailored to your scenario. Like the second edition, you could be fighting the deep ones in Innsmouth, and then all of a sudden you're reading an encounter card about something to do with the Silver Twilight Lodge hunting down Cthulhu, and it's like, well, hang on a minute, I'm supposed to be killing Azeroth here. What's the deal? Here, it's a lot more, not linear, but it's much more, focused on the IP or the scenario it's trying to do, so you shouldn't get that level of a weird sort of mismatch with the scenarios you're doing. Arkham Horror can, of course, be played solo, but you're essentially just playing multiple investigators. That's the best way to do it. I've enjoyed this solo as a sort of free player thing, you know, using 3 investigators, 2 max. Any more and it's a little bit too much. There's certainly a good variety of investigators to use. There's not as many cards as I would like, so the replay value of this is going to be a little limited to begin with. There's plenty of investigators, but you've only, I think, got 4 scenarios, and it doesn't allow for a huge amount of replay value with the encounter cards getting used over and over, but the locations changing up each game does help with that, because you won't use the same locations, they'll chop and change. So you might have East Town in one scenario but not in another, so those encounter cards don't get used if they're not in the game. It changes things up a notch. The monster deck will be different for each time. You know, you won't fight deep ones when you're fighting for Azeroth, for example. And so there is a reasonable amount of replay value, just not loads. But to be honest, that's a small gripe, because honestly, this is, like I said, Fantasy Flight, they're going to expand the hell out of this, and you just know that more cards will be on the way, so this is kind of it's a solid taster grounding of what this Arkham Horror 3rd Edition is going to be. It's just maybe not to be fair, have we had enough of Eldritch Horror and the previous other ones getting bloated beyond belief? It's kind of refreshing just to have something that's a condensed box by itself. At least for now, anyway.
We've got to have money.
So, overall, I do enjoy Arkham Horror 3rd Edition, but everybody's going to be asking, 2nd Edition versus 3rd Edition, which is best, which should I get, does it replace, etc, etc. That's a tough one, because one thing about this is that even though it's that same sort of premise, you know, big baddies coming down, you and the investigators have got to take them out, here's some encounters, like Eldritch Horror feels different to 2nd Edition Arkham Horror, I feel this one feels different enough from 2nd Edition Arkham Horror as well to be its own game. I mean, I've got no choice but to own both, but I feel that if you've owned the 2nd Edition, I don't think this is going to straight up replace the 2nd Edition, because I feel that it still feels like its own thing, even if the premise is the same. However, if you don't own any of the Arkham Horrors at all, you're probably going to get this one because for starters, it's probably really hard to find copies of the second edition anyway. And on top of that, this is definitely a much more streamlined, easier to learn experience. You know, I was getting taught it by someone who'd only played it once, and I just felt that, particularly as I had knowledge of Eldritch Horror and the LCG already, I just felt like it clicked a lot more. Stuff was familiar. I felt like, hang on, I recognise that. That's from the LCG. Okay, they've adapted it. That's pretty cool. And it just made it easier to get into. I feel that I could bring this to a game night and we could play it. It wouldn't take a million years to set up. It wouldn't take more than the night to play, although 2 to 3 hours, you could be looking at 4 hours for your first game, so really cap the player count, honestly. But yeah, you feel I could take this to a game night and get it done. You want me to take that thing to the game night, that giant wooden box? That ain't happening. It's not happening whatsoever. So it's it's a refreshing change. So overall, I do like it. I don't think you need to own both. I think that if you don't own any, this is a solid one to get. This is definitely very different from how Eldritch Horror feels and how Mansions of Madness feels and even how the LCG feels. So a lot of these games, you're going to have to pick your poison. Which do I like best out of all of them? Arkham Horror 2nd Edition has kind of fallen off my list, really, mainly just because I just never get the chance to play it because it's so bloated at this point. I'm getting to the point now where Eldritch Horror is now slightly above that because that's starting to get too bloated for its own good, even though it is easier to get to the table in that. The LCG was in my top 10 for my top 100, and it probably still will be, or at least my top 20 for next year at this rate. This one is kind of, so far I think it's in between Eldritch Horror and the LCG. It's definitely not as good as the LCG. And Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition, that was in my top 10 as well. It's not as good as Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition. You want the proper horror, ambient, oh my god, what's going to happen, suspenseful thing, you get Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition, seriously. This is kind of in between that and Eldritch Horror. This is more streamlined. I feel I'm going to play this more than Eldritch Horror, but Eldritch Horror is still great. I just don't think they replace each other. I think you've just got to pick your poison. What do you want? Do you want like the horror encounter theme just within Arkham? Do you want the global thing of Eldritch Horror? Do you want the app-driven ambient co-op nature of like the dungeon crawl aspect, like Mansions of Madness? Or do you want the card game that you can get done in a nice quick 1 hour or less time per scenario of the LCG and you don't mind having to buy more packs? Really, pick your poison. For me, this is still pretty solid. I don't think it's the bee's knees. I don't think it's changed the setup so much that it's like, oh my god, I must have this. But I enjoyed my time with it. Subject to my biggest issue, which is just that it's still such a long game. I wish that they'd condensed it down like 2 hours max. I think that would be great. And I can get it to 2 hours or less by myself. With other players, not likely to happen as much. And that is a bit of a gripe. So overall, I still really like it. Solid game all round. For me, personally, probably around the 8 mark, just in the 8 category. Sort of 7 and 8 it's arming on, but I'd give it an 8. And I still like it. I still think it's pretty cool. I think if you are interested in the Arkham Horror mythos and Mansions of Madness didn't quite take your fancy, give this one a try. I think you'll still pretty much like it. So that's the Arkham Horror 3rd edition. See you on the next episode of The Broken Meeple. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and check me out on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. But for now, remember, it doesn't matter if Azeroth, Cthulhu, or anybody else tries to suck your brains or drive you insane, it's still only a game. So hopefully, the world will still be here when you're done. Take care, and I'll see you on the next episode.